Okay, cool. Right. Hopefully you all know all of the procedural aspects of debating at this point. I'll just give you a reminder, of course, to state POIs. Otherwise, unless there are any questions, clarifications, or further issues, on the motion, this House opposes the dominant influence of popular culture on what constitutes good sex. I invite the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate cannot be won and lost with few examples because, of course, OP can argue for Sex Education, the Netflix show that does a good job of representing sex. But it's about the structural reasons behind what you see in a vast majority of content that you find on pop culture and the reasons why most of those things are likely to skew the narrative towards something that is bad. It can't be won on specific examples. The first thing I'd like to argue is what are the alternatives that we would prefer? Number one, we would prefer people to interact and understand sex themselves. So this looks like people who've never been exposed to sex start discussing by virtue of their relationship with each other, or if they just decide to have sex for the first time at the age of 16. They probably don't understand anything beyond, putting a penis inside a vagina or however they constitute sex. So they continuously converse and understand what is good for them individually rather than relate to a, code of reference to someone else. Number two, we prefer sex education classes to be prevalent in all kinds of education streams. So teachers and people with past experiences rationally explaining the value of using things like condoms, etc. Third, this is where we honestly are a bit confused. Pornography. We probably think based on the definition of pop culture, pornography, since it is widely consumed by popular mainstreams, is part of that. But even if it isn't, we do think it's still a better alternative than the existing mainstream forms of pop culture. This is because you interact with it knowing it is devoid of reality. Like when someone says, "You've been a naughty boy," of course, the vast majority of us realize that this is probably not a representation of reality, but the vast majority of movies and representations of art form, you associate more with being real and do think that it plays an integral part of your life. I won't make arguments about pornography. I hope opposition doesn't either. 4 reasons why we think this narrative is bad. First, let's understand structurally the way in which pop culture is created. For you to create entertainment media, you need to have a market for it. The vast majority of the market that exists today are majoritarian, i.e. people that can afford art forms and paying for those art forms. This looks like paying for, paintings that are really expensive, or art galleries that represent sex that are really expensive, or paying for movies in a world in which you already have COVID and a vast number of people are deprived of jobs. The ones that usually afford this are usually privileged white individuals and cis-het men or women. Or if you don't view it in terms of the market, they're usually represented by actors and artists that can pursue this as a career and take risks. Usually these actors are ones that are financially capable of taking that risk, because making it as an actor is a highly risky career choice and often doesn't work out. So you're likely to be part of a privileged background. So the kind of content that you're likely to see in a vast majority of content are part of the majoritarian standards of what you think would be good sex. So as a woman, you will see that the vast majority of guys that women tend to like are white. You'll see that the vast majority of actors that people appreciate are white, like the Chris Pines of the world, the Chris Hemsworths of the world. You never hear about the Indian guy from Eternals as the sexual fantasy of the vast majority of women in the world, but the vast majority of women do appreciate white men. This puts unrealistic standards on minority men and women within society because they believe they can never provide good sex because they don't live up to the standards of the Chris Hemsworths of the world. That's the first structural reason. The second structural reason is the way in which sex is used within content is to make it glamorized and make it exciting. And the reason is because if you really think about it, there's no reason why you'd want to watch a movie if it is a direct representation of reality. Because if you're just going and paying for a movie and you just want to see something that you see every day at home, there's no reason for you to do it. So they have to glamorize it, put a story to it, the love story that romanticizes the pursuit of a girl, how it eventually happens. And often this leads to things that are exaggerated. Like when it finally happens, the sex, it's made extra steamy, made extra great. So movies like 50 Shades of Grey, portray, that show, clothes being ripped off within elevators, really represent unrealistic standards of what ideal sex is. Because you can never have simplistic sex that involves taking a person to a room, being awkward, being shy, but it revolves around the extra steaminess, the confidence that you have to display as a man in order to represent what good sex is to a woman. The third is, usually sex, like the vast majority of movies are not about sex. So sex is just a small part of that movie. So why is sex then still made? Like the vast majority of movies would still have the same conclusion. You'd appreciate the same amount even without the sex. The reason why you still use it is to increase the marketability of it, particularly to male consumers. A lot of us have watched movies just to see Elizabeth Olsen naked. And the reason why you also often involve this process is because you want that male consumer base that has money to opt in. What this means is you're likely to cater to the standards of beauty that men consume the most and set unrealistic standards for women to opt into. So this looks like women putting on a lot of makeup, being submissive, doing all the things that men want them to do within that interval. This is because that interval of sex is not an integral part of the story. This pushes the narrative onto society that makes women feel like they have to be submissive within bedrooms, feel like they need to wear makeup, feel like they need to wear bootstraps to satisfy a man. They can't do it unless or anything else is not termed as good sex for the man. Fourthly, it sets an unrealistic standard that for you to have good sex, it has to be with the one. Before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
It seems to me the point you made earlier about knowing you've been a naughty boy is not real is also applicable to this stuff. Like, I don't think people are going to the cinemas thinking they will finally learn what cunnilingus is.
Okay, of course, debates about comparatives and degrees, you're literally being non-comparative, right? Fourthly, you think the extension of this romanticization of storylines leads to the biggest pop culture myth that we see today. For you to be happy, you need to find the one. And for you to truly have good sex is not just the physical experience of it, but the emotional attachment associated with that sexual experience. And this is the most frequently told story that we see in pop cultures all the time, whether it's movies like that are rom-coms or even stories about individuals suffering from loss in tragedies. All of it shows that you have to find the one for you to truly experience the true meaning of sex. Number one, this puts pressure on you to find the one. This means that you're deprived of proper sexual fulfillment because in the process of not having a personality fit, because two personalities adjusting is based on random probability, really unlikely, every sexual encounter you have, you feel like it matters less because it's truly not good sex you're enjoying. Number two, once you've had sex and you move on to someone else because you think that this person might be the one, but that second person doesn't offer you as good sex because she's not experienced, you start opting out of other factors within that relationship, like the fact that they may have a good personality and understand you more because you truly believe the sex you incur is not good enough. This is terrible for people. We just think it should stop.
Thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for the opposition bench.
Please offer POIs in the chat. Majoritarian societal opinions about sex might be imperfect, but the problem with open government is that they don't explain how you would otherwise form opinions in the first place. As someone who just watched sex education, I can guarantee that some of the current public discourse about sex is about embracing things like female orgasm and pleasure. It's about embracing things like queer sex. These were conversations that were previously shut out, and we are proud to embrace them on opening opposition. I'm going to be talking about two main things in this speech. Firstly, about characterizing how we form opinions about sex in the absence of popular culture and why it is actively problematic. And then secondly, characterizing what influences popular culture and why on balance it is better. Clash will be integrated. On the first thing, in the absence of popular culture, how do we form opinions about sex? Multiple things here. Firstly, I think that women are likely to perceive themselves as being extremely subservient in bed based on how women are generally socialized. So historically speaking, women were seen as being the properties of their husbands. And in general, women are socialized to be subservient to men in general, to smile and look pretty, even if you aren't happy, to make sure that you clean up after your husband, that then creates an implicit association that your needs in bed are less important. Therefore, women will tend to be less assertive. Secondly, the arbitrariness of your own confidence level. So if you perceive yourself as being less attractive, you're less likely to be demanding in bed. Thirdly, past experiences with other partners. So like if you had like a relationship for an extended period of time, you were treated a certain way in bed, that then becomes a benchmark for how you're likely to view future sexual experiences. Fourthly, porn. I agree it's kind of wishy-washy of like which side of the debate it's on. I don't think that porn is really popular culture. I think that popular culture has influenced porn to make it substantially better. I think that this is an institution that's often run and controlled by men, prioritizes male pleasure, never shows women in dominant positions. Finally, if you were lucky, you might get like some conversations from your parents. They grew up a long time ago, their sexual views are a lot more regressive. They kind of have a counter model of sex education. The problem is it's often based on sexual logistics, not sexual pleasure. Even if you know how to wear the condom, you don't really know what to do after that to actually make sex pleasurable for people. Given all of this, okay, I think that finally the other thing that Prob could say is like you talk to other people about sex and like what good sex is. But I think that there are a few problems with this. Firstly, a lot of people experience stigma surrounding conversations about sex in general, often due to like religious norms that exist within society, just kind of awkward. I think it's also like privacy norms that exist. You're often hesitant to just ask about other people's sex life unless they initiate that conversation. Secondly, a lot of people don't want to admit that they're bad in bed because they feel embarrassed about it. So they don't want to turn to their friends and be like, oh my gosh, what do I do? I think that finally, for women, advocating for sexual pleasure is often something that can be seen as kind of kinky. So if you like go to your friends and you're like, I want this, this, and that, I think in the absence of pop culture that has normalized this to a much larger extent, a lot of people are just perceived as having like weird sexual preferences. So therefore, the comparative is terrible. Under our side of the house, who is shaping popular culture? What does it look like? And why is something that is actively good? What popular culture looks like or shows like sex education, where they literally had a scene of a disabled person in a wheelchair sexually advocating for themselves, which I think is great amidst a historical climate where disabled people were extremely desexualized. Magazines like Cosmopolitan that talk a lot about sex, celebrities publicly and proudly talking about their sex lives with their partners. They often say things like sex is bad right now because a lot of women are not orgasming, that like good sex often involves people making choices, that some people like being subs, or like doms, and that like characterizing that women only have to be sub is something that is currently a problem. An important piece of characterization here is that while there is common agreement on some basic things like women deserve the right to experience sexual pleasure, there still are some competing public opinions about what good sex is because different writers have things like different sexual preferences. So do not let Gov get away with framing this as imposing a monolithic sexual preference on like other people. There are some subcultures right now who are saying like dominatrix BDSM can be very fulfilling for certain individuals. It's not just one person saying like what Gov says of like, oh, everything has to be like 50 Shades of Grey. What then are three structural reasons why norms shaped by society are likely to be actively positive? Firstly, a lot of sexual discourse was historically and continues to be shaped by the advocacy of the feminist movement because talking about sex for them was never stigmatized. Conversations about things like abortion, like slut shaming, like forms of assault were always very prominent in the movement. What this has meant is that feminism spoke about sex a lot and therefore they have had an influence on popular culture, especially as the movement has gained a continued amount of traction throughout history. I think a really important example of this is that feminism was the largest institution that pushed for the normalization of hookup culture and their opposition of slut shaming, something I don't think that Prop can just say would have occurred under their side of the house. Secondly, who are the people who are doing things like writing cosmopolitan articles and blogs? I think it is a lie to say it is only like privileged individuals. These are often younger, diverse progressives who are writing for these kinds of magazines. I think that the reason why this characterization is structurally true is that firstly, these people are often young because older generations, when sex was more stigmatized before the rise of things like hookup culture, feel more stigma about it. Therefore, it's often newer, younger generations who tend to have more progressive belief systems. But secondly, people who are writing about sex are often those who've had a lot of sex, who feel comfortable in that. There's also often a notion of like a lot of these people have often taken things like queer theory or gender study courses at school, which gives them a perceived degree of credibility, which is why they're hired by like sex columnists to write about these things in the first place. Finally, there's a built-in accountability mechanism because institutions fear being called out by the feminists and the LGBT+ movement for not being progressive enough. So Tinder right now literally has something on it which has stopped the Asian hate as a result of backlash of Asian men not getting swiped enough. 50 Shades of Grey was criticized a lot by like the feminist movement, for example, for glorifying forms of sexual assault. Therefore, there is an inbuilt accountability mechanism for like, if we're talking about shows and movies here, to be increasingly progressive. On the thing of like 50 Shades of Grey is bad, it's really like extra steamy. I think that this is a social discourse. It is internally diverse and is internally critical of itself. There was a lot of criticism of this. I think that while this is some of the discourse, there's also other incentives to make scenes like relatable to people because you also want to watch, like hear about sex as a kind of sex that you're having. You want to read about columns that are actually relatable to your own sex life, which in a lot of cases is not 50 Shades of Grey, which is borderline porn. Before I continue, I'll take back half.
Right. most of the older people in our generation watched 50 Shades of Grey, not sexual education. You've just taken what's popular with young people, not what's actual popular culture.
To be fair, I think a lot of people have kind of watched both. I think that's a really good thing because then you get diverse views of what sex are. And I'm going to explain all this now. What are the implications of everything that I've said? Firstly, and this is brand winning, this is really good for accessibility to individuals who would otherwise not have access to sexual discourse. People who live in conservative communities, people who live in rural areas, people who live in religiously conservative states within the developing world who would otherwise not have access to this kind of education. Popular culture with the rise of the internet is one of the most ubiquitous things in the entire world. Anyone who has Netflix is able to watch such education. Even in their worst case scenario of like, are people watching 50 Shades of Grey? I think that's probably better if people would otherwise not really have much understanding of what sex is whatsoever. I think in general, even if like beauty standards are like glorified, if you're seeing queer sex with like very, very hot people, that's probably better than people not seeing queer sex whatsoever. Secondly, at the very least, this provides a conflicting idea over how you view your own sexual identity. A norm is not forcing people to act a certain way in bed. If you're the kind of person who does not think that like orgasming is necessary for good sex, this norm is not imposing that on you. If you're a woman who still likes to be submissive, that is cool. But for people who would otherwise evaluate their own sexuality in a more unitary way, this provides a conflicting way to conceive of their own sexual identity. Finally, this is a really valuable gateway for discussions about sex. Women themselves often send cosmopolitan articles to one another about sexual pleasure and ask, are you happy in bed? It's an accountability mechanism for women with their partner to say, I'm supposed to be orgasming, this is not happening, this is the problem. There's often a gateway for conversations to make everyone's sex life better, could not be prouder to stand in opening opposition.